What if the first story ever told was not written in words, but carved into vibration, into clay that remembered the pulse of a vanished world? They say the oldest language on Earth sleeps beneath layers of dust, waiting for the right silence to speak again. Each symbol on those broken tablets seems to hum faintly, as if holding a memory too ancient for any alphabet to contain, a memory that predates the very idea of human history. Who were the ones who first pressed meaning into wet earth? Were they chroniclers of time, or survivors of something even older? Tonight, we listen for their echo. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history, and if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, East, and what time it is. They found it almost by accident, a fragment of clay buried in the shadow of the ancient city of Nippur. The archaeologists had come searching for the familiar, the mythic hymns of Sumer, the list of kings, the prayers to gods whose names had long been forgotten. But this tablet was different. Its script was older, the strokes uncertain, as if the hand that wrote it was not yet fluent in the language it carried. Beneath the surface, faint impressions suggested something erased and rewritten, as though someone had tried to hide an earlier message beneath the visible one. The air in the dig site was heavy that day. Sand drifted over the ruins like time itself refusing to be disturbed. One of the researchers noted that the tablet's symbols did not match any known catalogue of Sumerian cuneiform. They seemed transitional, as if belonging to a phase before writing was fully born, and yet the marks carried intention, rhythm, a strange sense of order that whispered of knowledge deeper than mere record-keeping. For centuries, historians have told us that writing began in Sumer around 3200 BCE, emerging as a system for trade, taxation, and temple inventories. But what if those first inscriptions were not economic at all? What if they were echoes of something far older, a reconstruction of a knowledge already lost? Some scholars, like Samuel Noah Kramer, hinted that even the earliest tablets carried cosmological weight, that the first accountants of history were also the last inheritors of a vanished mythos. When the researchers cleaned the surface under low light, they noticed something unsettling. The faint outlines of constellations were scratched into the clay's margins, crude but intentional. The Pleiades, Orion, a spiral form that matched no known Sumerian symbol, but seemed oddly astronomical. One professor whispered that this could not be coincidence. Why would a proto-scribe in ancient Mesopotamia embed a star map within an administrative record, unless what they were recording was not trade but time itself? Perhaps, they speculated, this was not a ledger of grain, but of cycles. Epochs remembered in symbols that survived the collapse of something greater. Could it be that the first Sumerians were not inventors, but restorers? That they remembered, imperfectly, a world before the flood, a world whose memory had to be translated into clay before it vanished entirely? The myth of the flood, found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Atrahasis, in Genesis itself, seems less like invention and more like memory. Across tablets from Uruk, Kish, and Lagash, the same refrain repeats: humanity once angered the gods, the earth was cleansed, the survivors began again. But beneath that moral surface lies a geological rhythm: the Black Sea flood, the sudden end of the Younger Dryas, the rise of the Persian Gulf. The ancient Sumerians lived in the shadow of these transformations, perhaps inheriting myths not from imagination but from testimony, stories whispered by ancestors who had watched the world drown. If the Nippur tablet was truly older than its peers, then it might contain the earliest attempt to remember that loss. Some believed the fragment was not a list at all, but a map, not of geography, but of lineage. The lines between symbols resembled genealogies, not kings, but beings, the Watchers, as later myths in Enochian lore would call them, entities who descended to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Could the Sumerians have preserved this memory under different names? The Anunna, the those who came down? Mainstream archaeology insists that such interpretations are fringe, that no evidence supports the literal descent of beings from the sky. Yet the texts themselves resist simplicity. The Sumerian word Anunna derives from An, heaven, and Kai, earth, those who descend from the heavens to the earth. Whether celestial or symbolic, the imagery persists with strange precision. The tablets of destiny, the me, the divine decrees of civilization, All are described as knowledge once held by the gods and transmitted to mankind. But what if that transmission was not myth, but a recollection of an ancient technological or cosmic order? Something humanity was trying to rebuild through ritual and script. In 1958, a lesser-known paper by archaeologist Henri Francfort suggested that the earliest Sumerian temples were not mere places of worship but observatories, structured to align with solstices, equinoxes, and stellar risings. The ziggurat, he proposed, was a bridge between planes, a ladder of measurement between heaven and earth. Could the first writing, then, have been born from this same impulse, an attempt to fix the patterns of the sky into the permanence of clay? The Nippur fragment disappeared soon after its discovery. The museum record lists it as misplaced during catalogue transfer. Some claim it was stolen, others that it disintegrated during cleaning. Only sketches remain, imprecise, incomplete. Yet its absence speaks louder than its presence. Every lost artifact becomes a kind of silence, a gap in the story that demands to be filled. We do not know what the missing symbols meant. Perhaps they were nothing. Perhaps they were everything. But what lingers is the feeling that humanity once wrote not to communicate but to remember, to resist forgetting what it could no longer comprehend. And maybe that is why the first words ever pressed into clay were not records of grain or tribute. Maybe they were laments, a civilization writing to the future, whispering, "We were here before and we forgot." What else have we forgotten? The silence that followed the discovery at Nippur was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of discretion. The archaeologists who examined the tablet knew it hinted at something difficult to explain within the accepted timeline of civilization. One of them, a young epigrapher named Carolyn Mercer, kept private notes that surfaced decades later. In them, she described her unease. "These marks," she wrote, "feel older than Sumer, as though the clay remembers a hand that predated even the invention of the reed stylus." She compared the impressions with Proto-Elamite and Proto-Canaanite symbols but found no match. Instead, what appeared on the tablet resembled geometric encoding, triangles nested within spirals, intersecting with straight lines that echoed the geometry found on Neolithic artifacts from Göbekli Tepe and Tel Caramel. How could this be? Göbekli Tepe was nearly 7,000 years older than Nippur, and yet, in that pattern of repetition, she sensed something intentional, an inheritance of shape, carried through generations of builders and scribes who no longer understood why they drew what they did. In Sumerian tradition, clay was not inert matter, it was sacred. The god Enki himself was said to have fashioned humanity from clay mixed with divine essence. Every tablet, then, was a reenactment of that first act of creation, a piece of earth brought to life by knowledge. To write was to animate dust, to breathe remembrance into matter. But if these earliest tablets carried geometry older than Sumer, then the question deepens. Who first taught humanity to encode memory into earth? Among the tablets recovered from Uruk, one fragment speaks of a time before writing, when the words of the gods were seen, not heard. Scholars interpret this as a poetic reference to divine communication through dreams or visions, but could it also hint at a pre-linguistic form of transmission? Symbols meant to evoke resonance rather than syntax. Carolyn began to suspect that what she held was not a text, but a harmonic, a pattern meant to vibrate rather than to be read. Her fascination drew her toward the work of Zecharia Sitchin, though she resisted his literal interpretations of extraterrestrial visitation. What intrigued her instead was his linguistic observation, that the term Anunnaki shared roots with words for royal seed, or bloodline of heaven. If Sumer's myths described beings descending to teach humanity, perhaps these stories encoded something less physical, but no less real, a transference of knowledge across epochs, a passing of flame between collapsing worlds. In 1963, a fragment of a cylinder seal from Kish added fuel to her private speculation. It depicted a figure surrounded by 7 spheres, their orbits crossing in perfect proportion. Astronomers noted that the configuration matched no known planetary alignment, yet the ratios between the spheres approximated the distances of the inner solar system. Was this coincidence? Or did early Sumerian art preserve a memory of observation more ancient than our records allow? The British Museum, where the seal resides, has long maintained that ancient artisans depicted the heavens symbolically, not scientifically. Yet the precision of those engravings, and their recurrence across unrelated sites, continues to trouble those who look too long. The same 7 spheres appear in Akkadian reliefs, in the iconography of the Babylonian god Marduk, even in later Hermetic diagrams from Hellenistic Egypt. It is as if a single image had travelled through time, its meaning growing dimmer with every retelling. Caroline began to see a pattern not in language but in transmission, the slow decay of an ancient system of thought. The first Sumerian texts, she realised, were less inventions than translations. Their scribes were not creating new knowledge but salvaging fragments of something older, reinterpreted through the limits of human memory. The myth of the me, the divine decrees given by Enki to Inanna, lists attributes of civilization, kingship, truth, music, weaving, law, as if civilization itself were a set of codes handed down. Each me was a frequency, a function of harmony. In the modern eye, these are metaphors, but in the ancient world they were literal. The idea that creation operates through vibration, that every act of order is a song. If one listens closely, even the structure of Sumerian hymns reflects this philosophy. Their meter and repetition were not artistic flourishes but methods of invocation, a means to attune the human voice to the rhythm of the cosmos. Could the first writing then be an attempt to preserve not meaning but resonance? Could those carved wedges be echoes of chants that once shaped cities, calendars, even consciousness? One late evening, Caroline played a recording she'd made of her fingers tracing the indentations of the tablet, brushing lightly across its grooves. She slowed the audio and noticed an odd sequence of tones, rhythmic, almost melodic. It was likely coincidence, the result of uneven surface texture and microphone sensitivity. But for a moment, she felt something strange, as if the sound was speaking in reverse, as if the clay itself were trying to hum. Within a year, she left the project. Her notes end abruptly with a single line. The tablet is not language, it is memory. It remembers what we have forgotten how to hear. She never published her findings. The academic world was not ready for a theory that blurred the line between sound, symbol, and consciousness. But her words linger, scattered among archives, like echoes awaiting rediscovery. And perhaps that is what the Sumerians were trying to do all along, to rebuild a bridge between matter and memory, between heaven and earth, a civilization of remembrance rising from silence, each stroke of the stylus a prayer that knowledge might survive the next forgetting. If those early scribes were not inventing civilization but restoring it, then who, or what, had first built the original? And where did their memory go when the flood came? When the waters receded, they say, the land of Sumer rose from the mud, a plain of shimmering clay, marked by the ghost outlines of forgotten cities. Yet even the Sumerians themselves spoke of earlier lands, Eridu, where the first kings reigned before the flood, Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, a paradise untouched by sickness or death. Archaeologists have searched for Dilmun for over a century, some pointing to Bahrain, others to the coast of Kuwait, but no excavation has ever matched the purity described in the texts. The oldest hymns call it the bright land of beginnings. Perhaps, as with so many myths, the geography was never literal. Perhaps Dilmun was a memory, the echo of a civilization erased. In the 1920s, a set of tablets from Eridu described something strange, a list of rulers who descended from the heavens and reigned for tens of thousands of years. This list, later known as the Sumerian King List, has long been dismissed as mythological exaggeration. Yet curiously, the text divides history in two, before the flood and after. It is as if the flood marked not a natural disaster, but a reset, the boundary between two distinct epochs of knowledge. The pre-flood kings are not portrayed as ordinary men, but as beings of impossible longevity, who ruled when kingship descended from heaven. What could this mean, if not divinity? Or perhaps something more terrestrial, a metaphor for technology, wisdom, or consciousness that came from elsewhere. Some researchers, like the late archaeologist Werner Keller, suggested that these descended rulers represented a priestly class of survivors from an earlier civilization, refugees of a cataclysm who seeded new cultures along the Tigris and Euphrates. Their descent might not have been celestial but literal, from the mountains, from highlands spared by the floods that erased the lowlands. And yet the imagery of descent persists across civilizations. In Egypt, gods arrive from the stars. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl sails across the sea bringing calendars and lore. In India, the Manas appear after each flood to re-establish cosmic order. Could all these stories point to the same underlying pattern, the cyclical restoration of knowledge following planetary collapse? Eridu's ziggurat, among the oldest in Mesopotamia, was dedicated to Enki, lord of the subterranean waters, keeper of wisdom. Beneath its layered bricks, archaeologists found not temples but wells, chambers and channels leading deep into the earth. Some interpreted these as ritual spaces for water offerings, but others noticed that the layout mirrored a spiral, a design identical to the one found carved on obsidian at sites in Anatolia and the Caucasus, the same pattern Caroline Mercer had noted on the Lost Nipper tablet. The spiral, ancient as fire itself, has always symbolized return, not repetition, but evolution through remembrance. Could it be that the architecture of Eridu encoded a cosmology of cycles, of knowledge descending, drowning, and resurfacing again? If so, perhaps the Sumerians did not simply worship the gods. Perhaps they were trying to reawaken them, within themselves. In one hymn to Enki, the poet writes, "Lord who turns darkness into light, who raises the dead lands to life." Scholars read this as a hymn to fertility, to irrigation. But the language carries an undertone of resurrection, of reactivation. The dead lands may not have been soil at all, but consciousness itself. For the Sumerians, the earth was alive, the rivers were veins of divine memory, the temple was an organ of perception. To rebuild after the flood was to resurrect the body of the world. But if Eridu was the cradle of such renewal, what preceded it? Beneath the temple's lowest level, beneath the brick and bitumen, excavators found a foundation of black silt and river clay, a layer dated long before 5000 BCE. Within that layer, scattered among broken pottery and reed impressions, were polished stones inscribed with geometric forms, circles intersecting triangles, resembling constellations. No cuneiform, no language, just geometry and alignment. The stones face southeast and toward the rising of Sirius. It is difficult to explain such precision without assuming intention. An intention implies continuity. Someone, long before Eridu understood the sky, they watched, measured, remembered, and when their world collapsed, whether by flood, climate, or fire, that memory was buried, waiting to be rediscovered by hands that no longer understood its purpose. Historians might call this romantic speculation, but the evidence remains stubborn. The earliest Sumerian myths speak of black-headed people created to bear the yoke of the gods. Yet in the same breath they describe these gods as of flesh, yet shining. Some interpret this as metaphor for divine authority. Others wonder if it recalls an encounter with another lineage, another remnant of pre-flood intelligence. If kingship descended, then what ascended in its place when the flood erased memory? Every rediscovery in archaeology seems to oscillate between revelation and erasure. For every artifact found, another vanishes. The Nippur tablet, Caroline's recordings, even the early excavation notes of Eridu's lower levels, lost during wartime archives transfer. It is as if history itself resists remembering, as though some invisible current draws its fragments back into silence. And yet, through that silence, the same question echoes. Why do the oldest myths sound like recollections rather than inventions? Why do they describe cataclysms in geological detail? Why do they align temples to stars, rebuild the same symbols and repeat the same lament? We forgot. Maybe civilization is not a linear story, but a circle. Each epoch climbs toward light, then falls again into the dark, leaving behind only traces. Patterns on clay, myths about gods, whispers about the watchers. Perhaps we are not the first humanity, but merely the latest who dares to remember. Somewhere, beneath the layered ruins of Eridu, the oldest foundations still rest in the silt, the same clay that once swallowed cities and preserved their ghosts. If we could listen closely enough, perhaps we would hear what the Earth has been trying to say for millennia. But what if the Earth itself is the tablet, and we are the ones still learning to read? At the turn of the 20th century, when British expeditions first mapped the southern plains of Mesopotamia, they noticed something curious. The old riverbeds beneath the Tigris and Euphrates twisted like veins, suggesting the rivers had once flowed differently. Beneath those channels, deep in the stratified clay, geologists found layers of burned silt, evidence of not one, but multiple floods, separated by centuries. Each layer told the same story: destruction, silence, renewal. And above each, a new settlement appeared, as if humanity kept returning to rebuild upon the bones of memory. If the flood was real, not as a single event but as a recurring cycle, then perhaps it marked more than environmental collapse. It marked forgetting itself. Each deluge washed away the archive of the world, and each rebirth began not from ignorance but from faint recollection. The Sumerians wrote that wisdom returned from the deep, that the arts of civilization were restored by those who remembered before. But who were these rememberers, and how far back did their memory stretch? In 1935, a team excavating near Shuruppak uncovered hundreds of tablets buried under flood sediment. Many contained everyday records, lists of livestock, inventories of barley, yet among them was a fragment unlike any other. It depicted a great vessel sealed in bitumen, its hull shaped like a disc, its interior divided into 7 concentric rings. The inscription beneath it referred to the Ship of Ziusudra, the Sumerian prototype of Noah's Ark. But unlike the biblical version, this ship was not meant merely for survival. It was a vessel of knowledge, a container for the seeds of all crafts. If taken symbolically, the text suggests that the Sumerians understood preservation not just in biological, but in intellectual terms. When the world ended, they sought to save memory. The seeds of all crafts might not have been literal grains, but records, tablets, instruments, symbols, knowledge sealed against oblivion. In that sense, the flood was not the end, but the archive. Curiously, this motif recurs far beyond Mesopotamia. In Egyptian lore, Thoth hides the sacred books of wisdom in a secret chamber to protect them from destruction. In India, Manu preserves the Vedas through deluge. Even in pre-Columbian myth, the god Viracocha saves the records of the First Age from the sea. Everywhere the same pattern. The flood is both catastrophe and concealment. Perhaps civilization survives not by endurance, but by burial. Among the Shuruppak fragments, one inscription puzzled linguists for decades. Its translation remains uncertain, but one phrase stands out. The stars fell silent, and the measure of the days was lost. Astronomers note that around 10,800 BCE, a sudden shift in Earth's tilt, the end of the Younger Dryas, altered the visible constellations from Mesopotamia's latitude. Could this celestial silence have been remembered, retold as divine retribution, encoded as myth? The sky changes slowly, but its memory is written in stone. If the Sumerians inherited knowledge from survivors of that ancient transformation, then their obsession with measurement, of stars, rivers, time, takes on new meaning. They were not merely building cities, they were recalibrating the world. The ziggurats, perfectly aligned to solstices, were more than temples. They were instruments, recalibration towers, tuning forks between heaven and earth. The priests who maintained them were not just theologians, but astronomers, geodesists, perhaps even guardians of a cosmic rhythm that humanity had lost. In one hymn to Nana, the moon god, the text declares, "He measures the months, he restores the forgotten paths of the heavens." Modern ears hear poetry, ancient minds might have heard instruction. The moon's cycles, encoded into temple rituals, restored time itself after its dissolution. When the stars fell silent, mankind rebuilt its clock through worship. Civilization, then, was not a spontaneous birth, but a repair. Yet there is something haunting in this idea. If civilization is restoration, then history becomes the archaeology of amnesia. Each age recovers fragments, misreads them, and calls the reconstruction new. The Sumerians may have thought they were inventing writing, irrigation and law, but perhaps they were deciphering the residue of an older science, transcribed imperfectly through myth. Caroline Mercer once described this phenomenon as echo memory, the persistence of knowledge long after its context disappears, a melody remembered without lyrics, repeated until its purpose fades but its beauty remains. She compared the Sumerian me to resonance fields, self-sustaining vibrations of order. If true, then the flood was not simply physical, but vibrational, a dissonance that shattered the world's harmony. The survivors, in rebuilding, were tuning the earth again. At Tel Abu Shahrain, the ancient Eridu site, ground-penetrating scans have revealed subsurface anomalies, chambers far below the known temple levels, perfectly circular and magnetically distinct. Officially, they are classified as natural cavities, but some researchers whisper of deliberate construction, perhaps an underground repository, a vault for what the Sumerians called the hidden tablets of the Abzu. The Abzu, in Sumerian cosmology, was not merely the freshwater abyss, it was the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom, where the plans of creation were stored. If such a vault existed, what might it contain? Early drafts of myth, the original measures of the heavens, or something stranger, knowledge encoded not in language but in sound, geometry, or frequency. A civilization that measured reality differently would leave traces incomprehensible to us. And perhaps that is precisely what we keep unearthing. Clues mistaken for decoration, alignment, or coincidence. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere beneath the alluvial plains of Iraq, still entombed in salt and time, lies a record that would rewrite everything. But maybe that record isn't a tablet or a chamber. Maybe it's the earth itself, layered like pages, written in sediment and silence. For now, we only touch the surface, shards of clay, fragments of stars, echoes of floods. But every discovery seems to whisper the same thing. We are remembering something we never knew we forgot. And if the flood was not just the end of an age, but the erasure of memory itself, then what happens when memory begins to return? The memory of water was never just a myth in Mesopotamia, it was the foundation of their cosmology. Every stream, every canal, every temple basin echoed a story of the abyss, Abzu, the primal ocean beneath the world where all knowledge slept. Enki, lord of that abyss, was not a god of storms or harvests like others, but of depth, of the unseen patterns beneath creation. His temples were not built upward but downward, layered into the earth, descending through brick and bitumen into darkness. To approach him was to move inward, not heavenward. When the priests of Eridu entered those chambers, they did not pray as we imagine prayer. They recited measurements, ratios, tones. Some hymns preserve their instructions. Speak the number of the waters, measure the voice of the reed, let the echo be your offering. It sounds cryptic, but perhaps these were the remnants of a science, an acoustic geometry. For the Sumerians, sound was a bridge between spirit and matter. The me, the divine decrees of civilization, were said to be sung, not written. The stylus came later. The first records, then, may have been auditory, tonal codices encoded into ritual. Archaeologists still uncover strange objects from early Sumerian strata, fired clay cones perfectly hollow bearing no text. Some believe they were architectural, meant to reinforce temple walls. Others suggest they were acoustic resonators. When sound passes through a row of them, the frequencies amplify, producing a deep harmonic hum. In one experiment, researchers reconstructed a small section of wall and found that when low-frequency chanting was performed nearby, the air itself seemed to vibrate in response. Was this accidental or intentional? Could ancient temples have been designed to tune consciousness, to bring worshippers into a shared frequency that mimicked the voice of the gods? Carolyn Mercer once theorized that the hidden language of the earliest tablets might be an attempt to capture these tonal patterns, visual representations of vibrational states, not spoken words. If true, the origins of writing would not be linguistic at all, they would be musical. In that sense, the flood myth gains new depth. To lose the measure of the heavens could mean losing the planetary resonance, the synchronization between human rhythm and cosmic order. The deluge becomes not merely an event of water, but of frequency, a disruption that untuned the earth. Civilization, then, was humanity's long effort to retune itself, to recover the music of the world, but not all remembered it the same way. In the ancient city of Lagash, inscriptions describe Enki's rival, Enlil, as the one who divided the tongues and scattered the measures. Mainstream translators interpret this as political symbolism, the division of power among city-states. Yet in mythic language, division of tongues implies the loss of a universal sound. Could this be a memory of the first dissonance, the fragmentation of shared resonance that once bound humanity? The farther one digs, the more this theme repeats: disconnection from source, followed by reconstruction. Each age seems to inherit broken fragments of something whole, a technology of balance disguised as theology. The laws of the gods may have been less moral commandments than instructions for tuning the self, the city, the planet. When later empires rose, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, their temples became taller, more hierarchical, more rigid. The quiet inner chambers of Eridu turned into monumental ziggurats. The descent into darkness gave way to ascent toward the sky. Somewhere along the way, humanity stopped listening and began building. And still, the myths warn. When the temple reaches too high, the waters will return. A cycle not of punishment, but of recalibration. For every tower that forgets its foundation, the earth sends its flood. In 2018, archaeologists analysing seismic data beneath southern Iraq identified unusual subterranean voids near Tel Abu Shahrain, roughly symmetrical, aligned to magnetic north. Preliminary imaging showed that the chambers formed a spiral descending pattern. Officially, they remain unexplored due to groundwater hazards. Unofficially, a small team of local researchers reported something stranger: low-frequency vibrations emanating from the site, detectable even without mechanical equipment. They called it the hum of the Abzu. It may have been coincidence, the resonance of wind and soil, but those who stood near the area described a palpable feeling, a heaviness, as if sound itself was remembering its source, a place still singing in a frequency older than speech. The notion that ancient architecture could hold acoustic purpose is no longer fringe. Studies at Saqqara, Malta, and Göbekli Tepe show that certain stone chambers amplify specific tones associated with human vocal range. The effect is physiological. Heartbeat slows, breath deepens, time seems to dilate. Ancient ritual then was not performance, it was calibration. And perhaps, deep within Eridu's mud-brick foundations, Sumer achieved something we no longer understand: harmony between human perception and planetary vibration. The oldest texts say Enki stored the Mi in the waters of the Abzu so that they could never be destroyed. When the world was remade, the decrees would rise again with the river. Perhaps the Nipper tablet, lost, rediscovered, and lost again, was one of those decrees, not written knowledge, but resonant code. If sound once carried wisdom, then silence itself became the library of time. And maybe that is the true nature of Sumer's mystery. Not a civilization obsessed with gods, but one haunted by the echo of its own origin, a voice they could no longer hear, yet could never forget. Each tablet, each hymn, each temple was another attempt to restore that lost harmony. To write was to tune, to build was to remember, to speak was to awaken what slept beneath the clay. But what if that hum, the vibration beneath Eridu, is not fading, but growing stronger? What if the earth itself is beginning to remember the frequency of its first creation? There is a moment in every excavation when silence feels heavier than discovery, when the soil seems to breathe beneath your fingertips, and you sense that something older than time itself is watching. Those who have dug through the ancient ruins of Sumer often describe this feeling. They call it the hum of the deep ground, the low vibration that rises from the layers of the earth when the past is disturbed. It is not sound exactly, but memory made tactile. The Sumerians might have called it the whisper of the Abzu. In 1951, a Sumerian cylinder seal was unearthed at Tel Uqair. The image on its surface showed a figure seated before a tablet, surrounded by streams of flowing water and 7 spirals above his head. Archaeologists immediately identified the figure as Enki, Lord of Wisdom. But one epigrapher noted something odd. The stylus in Enki's hand was not touching the clay tablet. It hovered above it, surrounded by thin etched lines like waves. Could this depict the act of writing through sound, a symbolic image of resonance rather than inscription? Such an interpretation would have been dismissed as poetic speculation, but the same motif appears on other seals from Uruk and Eridu. The act of writing is shown as vibration, as though the scribe were tuning reality rather than recording it. Perhaps in the beginning writing was not meant to preserve thought but to project it, to speak through clay, not into it. When Caroline Mercer wrote that the tablet is memory, she may have been closer to truth than she realized. The Sumerians believed clay was a living element, the condensed form of the divine waters of Enki. When shaped and impressed, it was not a symbol of permanence but a momentary freezing of flow. To inscribe was to slow time, to trap vibration, to hold memory still long enough to examine it. Every tablet was a fragment of the ocean made solid, a ripple caught mid-crest. Across thousands of surviving tablets, a curious consistency appears. Even the most mundane texts, accounting for sheep or barley, begin with invocations to cosmic order. Phrases like, "by the measure of heaven and earth," or "as decreed by the waters below." It is as though every act of writing, however small, was a ritual reaffirmation of cosmic harmony. To record was to participate in the maintenance of reality. Yet somewhere along the line, this understanding faded. The later Babylonian scribes wrote with precision, but not with reverence. The stylus became a tool of bureaucracy, not communion. Writing became a language of control, not of remembrance. The vibration stilled. Perhaps that is why so many later myths, from Babel to Babylon, carry undertones of lament. Humanity gained mastery of language, but lost the song beneath it. There are fragments in the Sumerian corpus that hint at this shift. One hymn from the Temple of Eridu speaks of a falling of tones, when the speech of the gods became divided and the reed of measure lost its sound. The phrase reed of measure likely refers to the writing stylus, but it could also mean the instrument used in temple music. A pun, perhaps, or something more. A recognition that language and sound were once one. To lose the sound of the reed was to lose both the written and the resonant word. The legend of Inanna descending into the underworld may also conceal echoes of this loss. Before her descent, Inanna removes 7 sacred mi, the decrees of civilization, 1 at each gate. As she travels deeper, she becomes more human, more silent. When she finally reaches the realm below, she is stripped bare, voiceless. Only through resurrection does the voice return, rising again through the 7 gates. Scholars see a myth of death and rebirth. But perhaps it is also a story of forgetting and remembering, the descent of vibration into matter, and its slow ascent back into awareness. Some archaeologists have noted the peculiar recurrence of 7 in these myths. 7 gates, 7 spirals, 7 mi, 7 planetary spheres. In acoustic physics, 7 frequencies form the basis of the diatonic scale, the ancient measure of harmony. Could it be that myth, music, and measurement were once the same science? The Sumerians did not separate cosmos from consciousness. To them, the world was not made of matter, but of movement, of oscillations. In the late 1970s, a geologist named Robert Schoch analysed clay from early Mesopotamian sites and found microscopic magnetic alignments in certain tablets. The clay had been fired unevenly, leaving traces of magnetic orientation consistent with exposure to alternating fields. He proposed that temple furnaces or lightning could have produced such effects, but others quietly speculated. Could the firing have been deliberate? Could early scribes have known how to imprint information in magnetic patterns, encoding memory not only in form but in field? The idea sounds impossible, yet the Earth itself stores history through magnetism. Perhaps the first libraries were magnetic long before they were textual. If so, then the act of inscribing clay might have served 2 purposes: to fix sound in shape and to align that shape with the Earth's own field, a ritual synchronization between human intention and planetary resonance. The temple was both laboratory and amplifier, the priest both scientist and musician. Civilization in this view was not built against nature but in tune with it. But such alignment is fragile. The Sumerian texts repeatedly warn that when humanity forgets the mi, the decrees of balance, chaos returns. The flood is described not as divine punishment, but as consequence, the natural rebalancing of a dissonant world. When the tone of heaven grows weary, one hymn says, the waters rise to silence it. In our age, we might interpret that literally, a climate cycle, an ecological correction. Yet to the ancients, it was spiritual, the planet's attempt to retune itself. The Sumerians believed that if mankind lost harmony with the Abzu, the deep waters would reclaim the surface. The world would drown not in anger but in renewal. Perhaps this is what every civilization faces, the slow drift out of tune. We measure, build and calculate, but the hum grows faint beneath our cities. The clay remembers, but we no longer listen. And somewhere, buried under Eridu's silence, that vibration may still be waiting. A song older than humanity, still resonating beneath the dust. If we could hear it again, would we recognize the voice that once spoke us into being? Every ancient civilization left behind fragments of sound, echoes fossilized in stone and clay. But nowhere does that echo seem more deliberate than in Sumer. The very landscape was composed to speak. The rivers arranged like strings, the ziggurats rising like frozen notes in a song only the gods could hear. To modernize, these are ruins. To ancient ears, they were instruments. Each city, each temple, each wall was tuned. Long before the word acoustics was born, the Sumerians had already mapped its mystery. In the ruins of Ur and Eridu, the ratio of step heights in temple stairways mirrors the intervals of ancient harmonic scales, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. The proportions recur in room dimensions, basin depths, and altar placements. They seem to have built by vibration rather than by blueprint, as if the act of walking into the sacred space was meant to modulate the body's own resonance. When a priest intoned the hymns to Enki or Inanna, his voice would strike the walls, multiply, and return softened, a feedback loop of devotion and geometry. It is said that when the temple resonated perfectly, water began to ripple in its basins without wind. The Sumerians called this moment the awakening of the waters. To them, it was proof that heaven and earth were once again aligned. Centuries later, when Babylon rose, those who inherited Sumer's wisdom built upon these principles but forgot their purpose. The temples became theatres of spectacle, not listening. The chants were repeated, but their tones shifted. The measurements persisted, but their meaning dissolved. Each generation replicated what they no longer understood, like someone copying a melody without hearing the tune. It is this pattern that echoes across all of human history. The preservation of form, the loss of essence. From the coded hymns of Egypt to the Gregorian chants of medieval Europe, remnants of Sumerian frequency still hide, changed but not erased. The major intervals of modern music trace their lineage to Babylonian mathematical tables. The tonal scale, long believed to have been invented by the Greeks, may in fact descend from these earliest calculations of celestial harmony. The very idea that the cosmos can be measured in ratios, that reality is vibration, was born in the mud of the Euphrates. But not all knowledge survived translation. Among the broken tablets of Nippur, one stands apart, the so-called Tablet of Measures, preserved only in fragments. It lists lengths, weights, and values, yet interwoven among the numbers are invocations, short phrases that make no mathematical sense. The breath of the sun, the second silence, the pulse of the sea. For years, scholars called them poetic insertions, metaphors for time, but Caroline Mercer once argued that they were calibration terms, references to resonant intervals perhaps tied to planetary motion. She wrote, "If these are measures, then they are not of distance, but of vibration. The ancients measured the world by its sound." That idea might seem mystical, but it aligns with what modern science now calls the resonant frequency of matter. Everything, stone, air, even human thought, vibrates. The Sumerians may not have expressed this in equations, but they embodied it in architecture, music, and myth. Their gods were not abstract beings. They were frequencies personified. Enki, the deep tone. Enlil, the breath of wind. Inanna, the rising overtone of love and war. The pantheon was a harmonic spectrum, a symbolic orchestra of creation. When floods erased their cities, perhaps it was not merely the clay that was buried, but the tuning itself, the loss of the planetary chord that once kept humanity in balance. Each civilization since then has attempted to reconstruct that lost harmony. Egypt through proportion, Greece through geometry, India through mantra. Every religion that chants, every ritual that repeats sound, may be an unconscious attempt to call back the vibration that was lost when the world drowned. In 2019, researchers from the University of Pisa conducted a sound mapping survey of Eridu's foundations using seismic sensors. They found that at certain low frequencies, around 110 Hz, the site emitted natural resonances matching the pitch range of the human male voice. When spoken into, these frequencies amplified rather than dissipated. The voice merged with the ruin, as if the earth were answering back. Such findings are easily explained by acoustics. Yet one cannot help but wonder if the ancient builders already knew this, if the temple was deliberately constructed to make the world itself speak. For the Sumerians, the divine was not above, it was within the hum of matter. The Abzu was not mythic ocean, but the deep vibration running beneath everything that exists. There is a line from an untranslated hymn, broken at both ends. The clay remembers the song of its forming. When I first read it, I thought of Caroline Mercer tracing her fingers across the grooves of the lost tablet, hearing tones that no one else could hear. Perhaps she wasn't imagining it. Perhaps the clay really does remember. If we were to listen, truly listen as to the stones of Eridu, what would they reveal? The patterns of flood and renewal, the frequencies of forgotten speech, or something stranger, a faint pulse beneath our feet, older than human breath, the earth's own dream of itself. The Sumerians believed that sleep and death were not ends but returns, descents into the Abzu where the mind was retuned before rebirth. The same cycle may apply to civilizations. Each one sleeps, forgets, dreams, and rises again, carrying fragments of the last song. That might explain why certain myths feel déjà vu, why ruins across continents share proportions, why humanity keeps building towers and temples in the same sacred ratios. We are remembering through imitation. Maybe that is why the stories of gods descending from the sky or emerging from the waters persist. They are metaphors for resonance returning, higher frequencies re-entering the material plane, and each time humanity rediscovers them we call it enlightenment. Then, slowly, we forget. The tone fades, silence swells, and history begins again. If civilization itself is an instrument, then perhaps the question is not who built the first cities, but what melody were they meant to play? And if the music of the world still lingers beneath us, waiting for recognition, what will happen when we remember how to listen? When we imagine the cradle of civilization, we often picture sunlight, the shimmering gold of temple bricks, the glint of river water on clay tablets. But beneath the light of Sumer there was always shadow. The oldest hymns never praise the sky without invoking the underworld. Every temple of Enki, every shrine to Inanna, was mirrored by an unseen counterpart, a chamber below where the silence of the earth was honoured as much as the brilliance of heaven. In the ruins of Ur, archaeologists found one such chamber sealed in bitumen. Inside lay fragments of bowls, crushed reed baskets, and, most strangely, a layer of black sand unlike any found in the region. Spectrographic analysis revealed traces of magnetite and obsidian, volcanic minerals not native to Mesopotamia. Some theorized they were traded from Anatolia, but a few researchers wondered if they were brought intentionally, chosen for their reflective and conductive properties. To the Sumerians, obsidian was the mirror of the underworld, a material through which the unseen could be glimpsed. Perhaps these were not ritual offerings, but instruments, mirrors used not for vanity, but for memory. Ancient texts describe the waters below not merely as physical reservoirs, but as repositories of time. The Abzu was the archive of creation, where every event echoed eternally. To descend into it was to enter the memory of the world. The priests of Eridu spoke of mirrors that do not reflect light but sound, devices that allowed them to see the songs of the deep. Whether metaphor or memory, such lines suggest that the ancients believed knowledge could be perceived directly through vibration, bypassing words altogether. Modern physics speaks of a similar concept, the idea that all matter vibrates, that reality itself may be a hologram of resonance. But for the Sumerians, this was not theory, it was theology. The gods were not separate beings, but frequencies, patterns within the great ocean of the Abzu. Enki's wisdom was the low hum of the earth, Inanna's passion, the rising overtone that stirred movement into form. To tune oneself to these divine harmonies was to remember one's origin. It is no coincidence that their word for truth, Kien-gi, also meant place of rightful resonance. The idea that truth was not factual but vibrational, alignment between inner tone and cosmic order, may explain why their temples were designed like instruments. The architecture itself sought to harmonize the soul of the visitor with the rhythm of the cosmos. The act of worship was not belief, but calibration. In 2004, a joint Iraqi-French excavation at Tel el-Muqayya the ancient Ur, discovered an unusual pattern in the soil beneath a ruined ziggurat. The chamber's layout, viewed from above, resembled a 7-pointed star surrounded by circular trenches. When ground-penetrating radar was used, faint anomalies appeared at each point, areas of dense mineral content, as if something metallic had been placed and long since eroded. The excavation report mentioned possible ritual deposits, but one geophysicist privately suggested that the pattern could form a rudimentary resonant chamber. If excited by low-frequency vibration, such a design could amplify standing waves. If this was deliberate, then the ancients of Ur were manipulating sound and energy in ways we barely understand. Were these chambers meant for worship or for remembering? The tablets speak often of the sleep of the gods, a dormancy in which divine voices retreat into silence until the right tones awaken them again. Perhaps the priests of Ur were not praying to gods above, but calling forth something buried within the earth itself. There are later echoes of this idea in Akkadian myth. When Marduk creates the world from the body of Tiamat, the chaos dragon of the deep, he does so by dividing her with the measure of sound. Creation emerges from resonance, the spoken decree, the shaping vibration. The Sumerians would have understood this intuitively. Their gods created not by hand, but by tone. The act of naming was the act of bringing forth. If this cosmology is memory disguised as myth, then perhaps the earliest civilizations did not invent agriculture, writing, and architecture from nothing. Perhaps they reactivated dormant knowledge embedded within the Earth itself, knowledge that awakens whenever the planet's frequency shifts. The flood, then, becomes a global retuning, a cataclysmic cleansing of dissonance, resetting the harmony between matter and consciousness. The fragments of obsidian and magnetite found under Ur may be remnants of that practice, materials chosen for their capacity to hold resonance, much like the crystal oscillators in our own modern technology. To the ancients, these were sacred stones, alive with memory. When placed in circular formation, they could have created standing wave patterns in the temple's lower chambers, inducing trance or altered awareness. This might explain the peculiar descriptions in Sumerian poetry of the voice of the earth that answered when no one spoke. These were not hallucinations, but experiences born of resonance, the natural consequence of vibrating matter meeting human perception. It would not have been magic to them. It was simply the architecture of remembering. And if the earth holds memory, if every vibration ever made remains stored within its frequencies, then the Sumerians were not building monuments to their gods, but interfaces with the planet's consciousness. The temple became a translator, converting the hum of the Abzu into human language and back again. The poet of the Eridu Genesis once wrote, "When the gods walked with men, their footsteps were songs." Perhaps that was not poetic exaggeration. Perhaps those songs were literal, the resonance of frequencies that once bridged two forms of intelligence, one of flesh, one of stone. Today, all that remains are ruins. But when wind moves across the plains of ancient Sumer, a low tone still rises, a vibration between sand and air. Some say it is only the sound of distance. Others swear it feels like a pulse, faint but steady, echoing from beneath the ground. And if that pulse has never stopped, if the Abzu still hums beneath us, then maybe the gods of Sumer were never gone. Maybe they are still dreaming, waiting for the right vibration to wake again. When that day comes, will we recognize their song? Or will it sound like our own heartbeat, long forgotten, finally returning? In the myths of Sumer, there is a phrase that recurs like a heartbeat, when the black soil remembers. To modern translators, it means the moment of spring, when the land awakens after flood. But perhaps it means something deeper, the earth itself remembering its pattern, recalling what was written into it long before human history began. The Sumerians lived with the conviction that matter could think, that clay, stone, and water retained memory. And so they built their temples not to gods in heaven, but to the memory of the earth itself. When excavators first unearthed the lower levels of Eridu, they discovered not grandeur but humility, layer upon layer of small, simple structures, each built upon the remains of the last, each aligned to the same axis, each following the same silent geometry. It was as if every generation knew exactly where to rebuild, guided not by blueprint but by instinct. The archaeologists called it ritual reconstruction. The Sumerians might have called it remembering. At the heart of those earliest foundations lay a single baked brick, engraved with an inscription so faint it was almost erased. To the deep that remembers all things. Scholars argued whether it referred to the Abzu, to Enki, or simply to the river itself. But what if it referred to the earth, to the living intelligence that sleeps beneath every civilization, waiting for resonance to awaken it? Geologists studying Mesopotamia have long noticed something peculiar. The alluvial plain is one of the most acoustically responsive terrains on Earth. Vibrations travel through it with remarkable clarity. Even the smallest tremor can echo for miles beneath the surface. The ancients may not have known the physics, but they felt it. The ground itself spoke to them. The Abzu was not mythic. It was physical. The underworld was sound. If that is true, then the temples of Eridu and were not merely religious spaces. They were resonant engines, chambers designed to awaken the memory within the earth. When priests sang, their chants may have travelled downward, echoing through the clay, creating ripples that stirred layers older than civilization itself. The ritual was not worship, but dialogue. Humanity was speaking to its own origins. Caroline Mercer once wrote, "To remember is to vibrate in sympathy." She believed that every act of memory, whether personal or cosmic, was a form of resonance, a frequency re-entering alignment. The Sumerians, she argued, understood this long before modern neuroscience or physics. Their myths were blueprints of coherence. The flood was not divine punishment. It was the breaking of resonance between earth and sky. The rebuilding of cities was the tuning process. Civilization was restoration, not invention. In one fragment from the temple hymns of Enheduanna, the first known poet in human history, she writes of a house whose light is sound, whose song rises from the mud. Scholars assume metaphor, yet perhaps she meant it literally. A building that glowed with resonance, its sound transforming darkness into light. Ancient observers might have witnessed real phenomena, the luminescence of quartz, the shimmer of vibration through mineral dust, the shimmer of consciousness itself. The later Babylonian scribes tried to codify this inheritance into order. They turned resonance into mathematics, myth into astrology, prayer into law. But in doing so, something was lost. The living pulse replaced by static symbols. The clay still remembered, but the scribes no longer listened. They wrote about gods as distant, untouchable, ruling from the sky, while their Sumerian ancestors had seen the divine everywhere, in the breath of wind, in the hum of water beneath the floor. Some archaeologists have quietly noted that the deepest levels of Eridu predate the supposed dawn of civilization by centuries, perhaps millennia. The pottery is cruder, yes, but the alignments are exact, as though the builders inherited plans from an earlier culture. Could there have been a lineage of memory, survivors of an older world who passed down the knowledge of resonance through symbols and myth? In one of the oldest Sumerian texts, the instructions of Shurupak, a father warns his son, "Do not neglect the words buried in silence. They are the oldest truths." The phrase seems obscure, but perhaps it reveals their philosophy, that true wisdom is not written, but remembered from within, vibration rediscovered through stillness. Their education was not about learning new information, but about tuning the mind back to the frequencies of the cosmos. We might see this in their art, the spirals carved into bowls, the concentric circles etched into cylinder seals, the rhythmic repetition of lines in their hymns, even their script. The wedge-shaped cuneiform moves from broad to narrow strokes, echoing the compression of sound waves. Everything about their civilization mirrors the pulse of vibration, the oscillation between expansion and contraction, descent and ascent, silence and speech. But perhaps the most haunting discovery comes not from clay, but from sound itself. In 2017, a team at the University of London's Institute of Archaeology used digital modelling to reconstruct the acoustics of a Sumerian temple, based on surviving measurements. When they played recordings of ancient Sumerian hymns inside the model, a remarkable thing happened. At specific tones, the virtual chamber produced secondary harmonics, frequencies below the range of human hearing. Infrasound, the same frequency range associated with altered consciousness, deep emotion, and physiological resonance. The experiment was never widely published, dismissed as speculative archaeology. But the results echo what the ancients always claimed, that the gods could be felt before they could be seen. It is possible that in those low frequencies something ancient stirs, not supernatural, but elemental. The hum of the earth aligning with the rhythm of human breath, the pulse of clay and consciousness merging once again. Perhaps this is why the Sumerians called their land Kiengi, the place of noble earth, not because they ruled it, but because they listened to it, and through that listening, they remembered what it was to be part of a living planet. But what if the earth remembers too? What if, beneath the dust of Vur, beneath the cracked riverbeds of Nippur and Lagash, the clay still holds the resonance of human thought, the tones of hymns sung thousands of years ago? What if, one day, as the planet shifts again, those frequencies rise to the surface, carrying with them the memory of the first civilization that learned to listen? When that happens, will we recognize the song, or mistake it for thunder? There is a passage in the Kesh temple hymn that has puzzled translators for generations. It speaks of a house raised from the ground that knows the whispers of the deep, whose walls answer when called. To most it is poetic exaggeration, an early metaphor for divine presence. But to those who have walked among the ruins of ancient Sumer, where wind moves through the hollow bricks and produces a low haunting tone, it feels less like metaphor and more like memory. The house that answers when called. A temple that listens back. The more we study these ruins, the clearer it becomes that sound, not sight, was the organizing principle of their world. Every measurement, every hymn, every ritual was built around resonance. It is possible that the very word Sumer, Kiengi, the land of the lords of resonance, once meant something closer to land that vibrates in truth. If one follows the ancient channels of the Euphrates far enough south, the land sinks into marshes, and beneath the mud strange stones are found. They are not bricks, nor tools, but rounded pillars, smooth as if shaped by flowing water. Geologists have dated some to before 6000 BCE, long before Sumer's emergence. Some bear faint grooves, circular, rhythmic, like the record of motion repeated endlessly. They call them drums of clay. Local workers describe them differently, the bones of the ground that sing when struck. Caroline Mercer once wrote that every layer of earth is a record, and that archaeology itself is a form of listening. She meant it metaphorically, but the Sumerians might have taken it literally. To dig was to awaken. To unearth was to disturb the sleeping tones of the Abzu. Perhaps that is why the priests treated excavation as sacred, and why temples were built on top of ruins, each new structure amplifying the last. Civilization, in this view, was not progress, but deepening. Modern instruments confirm what the ancients must have sensed intuitively. The soil of Mesopotamia carries vibration extraordinarily well. When wind or water moves through it, it produces low-frequency oscillations detectable even kilometers away. The ancients did not have sensors, but they had skin, breath, rhythm. They could feel the hum beneath their feet, hear the pulse that moved through their temples, sense the deep, unbroken continuity between earth and sky. To them, divinity was not a separate realm, but the audible structure of existence. Enki, the god of wisdom, was the frequency of the deep. Enlil, the god of air, the motion of breath. Inanna, the tension between love and war, harmony and chaos, the resonance of transformation itself. These were not metaphors, but ontologies. The gods were tones within a living chord, and humanity was one instrument among many. There are modern parallels. In quantum physics, every particle is understood as a vibration, a field oscillating at a specific frequency. Some call this the music of the cosmos. The Sumerians called it Mi, the divine measures. Both describe the same truth, that existence is not matter, but movement. The Sumerians knew this not through equations, but through intimacy, through ritual, through architecture, through song. It is possible that this is why their civilization appeared so suddenly, so complete. Writing, irrigation, law, astronomy, all emerged in a span of centuries, as though inherited rather than invented. The Sumerians themselves said they were taught by those who descended. Perhaps descended did not mean from the sky, but from the past. knowledge resurfacing after ages of silence, civilization as remembering, not creation. But memory is fragile. Once the harmony of resonance is broken, the song becomes noise. The later Akkadians wrote of the gods withdrawing their tones, of the loss of the measure. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, transforms vibration into conflict. Marduk slays Tiamat with a wind and divides her body by the sound of his word. Creation becomes conquest. The tone becomes command. Humanity's voice, once tuned to the cosmos, becomes an instrument of domination. Still, in the oldest layers, something quieter remains. Beneath the ruins of Lagash, archaeologists found a single plaque engraved with a phrase that resists translation. The tone returns when the clay is broken. It could mean destruction or revelation, that in the moment of ruin, the original resonance is released. When walls collapse, the trapped sound of centuries escapes. Perhaps that is what the Sumerians believed the flood truly was, the breaking of the world's walls, the release of its stored sound back into the sea of vibration. Caroline Mercer once described a dream she had while working at the British Museum. I heard the ground singing. It was not music, but memory. She wrote it in her notebook and never explained further. But maybe that is all this story has ever been, the earth remembering itself through us. Every temple, every artifact, every myth, a chord in the great forgotten composition of being. If we could gather every surviving tablet, if we could reconstruct their lost tones, perhaps we would hear not words but harmonies, frequencies that once shaped the rivers, guided the stars, and whispered the first instructions for civilization. The Sumerians believed the gods built humanity from clay, not to control it, but to give matter a voice. Writing in that sense was the continuation of creation, vibration made visible. Now, as the world trembles with the hum of machines, one might wonder if we're approaching another resonance shift, another moment when the tone of the planet changes, when memory floods back through the cracks. The Earth hums constantly at around 8 cycles per second, the Schumann resonance, the same rhythm that calms the human brain in dreams. The ancients may not have measured it, but they felt it. The temples of Sumer were built to amplify it. Perhaps the first civilization was not the beginning, but the midpoint, a restoration between worlds, a tuning before the next descent into silence. And perhaps what we call progress is only another movement in that long oscillation, forgetting, remembering, forgetting again. If so, then the ruins of Sumer are not relics, but reminders, the silent notes of a song still unfolding. Somewhere, beneath the shifting sands, the hum continues, deep and patient, waiting for ears capable of hearing it again. When that sound returns, will it arrive as revelation or as the next flood? By the time the Sumerians vanished from the map, their language was already a ghost. Akkadian scribes copied their words for centuries afterward, long after they stopped being spoken. The language became sacred, a relic preserved for ritual, like a chant whose meaning is forgotten, but whose tone still carries power. And yet, through that echo, something survived. Even as empires rose and fell, the memory of Sumer's resonance lingered. In architecture, in myth, in the strange obsession with stars and floods that stretched from Babylon to Egypt to Greece. Perhaps the truest survival of Sumer was not in language at all, but in vibration, in the geometry and proportion that governed sacred design for millennia. The same ratios that shaped the ziggurats of Ur appear in the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Delphi, even in Gothic cathedrals half a world and 3,000 years away. These structures, though separated by time and culture, seem to follow an unspoken rule, align the human form with the cosmic pulse. To build was to tune the earth again. In 2008, an acoustics researcher named Paul Devereaux published a study of ancient ceremonial sites including Mesopotamian ruins, concluding that they all shared one phenomenon, a natural resonance around 110 Hz, the same frequency range that induces altered states in the human brain. The Sumerians could not have measured this numerically, but they could feel it. The temples of Enki, with their thick mud brick walls and narrow chambers, would have amplified that exact tone. When a priest chanted deep and slow, the entire building would have vibrated, a convergence of voice, architecture, and earth. The worshipper would not hear the god, they would become the god's resonance. This might explain why the earliest hymns are written not in third person, but as dialogue. The gods speak through the human mouth, and the human answers with the same breath. There is no separation, no pleading to the sky, only a shared frequency. To worship was to remember the original chord, and perhaps, when that chord faded, so did the gods. Caroline Mercer once described this as resonant erosion, the gradual loss of coherence between humanity and the environment. The more we abstracted the divine, the more the world fell silent. Stone became inert, rivers became resources, and language lost its vibration. We began to speak without listening, to write without echo. Civilization grew louder, yet emptier. The Sumerians seemed to foresee this. In one late text, the Lament for the poet cries, "The storm devoured the sound of the reed. The holy measure no longer hums." It is both mourning and prophecy. The awareness that once the resonance dies, the city follows. Archaeologically, Ur's destruction by Elamite forces around 2000 BCE aligns with this poem, but perhaps the physical ruin was only the shadow of a spiritual one. The hum had already stopped. Still, across centuries remnants of that sound reappear. In early Hebrew mysticism, the voice of God is described not as thunder, but as a thin, continuous vibration, the still small voice. In the Vedic hymns of India, the universe begins with the syllable Om, the sound beneath all sounds. Even in Greek philosophy, Pythagoras taught that the planets sang, a harmony of the spheres. These are not coincidences, but reflections, linguistic fossils of the same ancient understanding that the Sumerians once lived by, that existence is made of sound, and that forgetting it is death. If this idea feels strange, it may be because we have inherited only its ruins. Our instruments still measure vibration, but our hearts no longer align with it. We study resonance in laboratories, but we no longer experience it as meaning. Yet the evidence persists, buried in the bones of civilization. When modern engineers reconstructed the great ziggurat of Ur in simulation, they noticed something remarkable. At sunrise and sunset, the wind passing through its stairways produced a tone, low, continuous, almost like the opening note of a distant chant. This tone, when measured, fell within the same 110 Hz of frequency range as those sacred sites across the world. It could have been coincidence, or it could be memory, the sound of the world remembering itself through architecture. There are stories too, half mythic, half forgotten, of those who could hear this tone directly. The Apkallu, the 7 sages said to have emerged from the waters of the Abzu, were described as men who spoke with the voice of the deep. Their counsel gave birth to civilization itself. Later generations turned them into half-fish, half-man hybrids, the ancestors of the fish god Oans of Babylonian legend. But strip away the imagery, and a deeper meaning surfaces. They were the translators between worlds, tuning humanity to the voice beneath the waters. Their descent then was not physical but vibrational, the re-entry of harmony into chaos, and when their song faded, humanity was left with echoes, rituals without purpose, temples without tone, language without pulse. Yet those echoes still shaped us. Every act of creation, art, music, story, is an unconscious attempt to find the lost chord. Caroline Mercer's final unpublished paper, recovered from her estate, contained only one line beneath her title. The hum is still there. She never elaborated. Perhaps she meant it metaphorically, that the impulse to remember never dies. Or perhaps she meant it literally, that beneath the frequencies of cities, electricity and ocean currents, a low sound still threads through the planet waiting for alignment. The ancients believed that when the tone of the earth changed, consciousness changed with it. New ages began not through conquest but through resonance, through the return of forgotten harmonies. The flood was one such reset. What if another waits in silence, preparing to rise again? The idea may sound apocalyptic, yet to the Sumerians it was renewal, not destruction. Every deluge returned the world to the Abzu, to stillness, to possibility. And then, from the mud, a new civilization emerged, remembering a little less, but carrying the vibration forward, Maybe that is what our own age is approaching. Not an end, but a retuning. The hum beneath our machines, our networks, our voices, it is the same hum that once echoed in Eridu's temples. We have forgotten the melody, but the instrument remains. The question is whether we will remember in time, or whether the world, faithful to its own rhythm, will wash us clean once more until the tone returns by itself. If the hum still lingers beneath our feet, perhaps it has never truly gone silent. Perhaps it only shifted beyond the range of our perception. The Sumerians believed that memory itself vibrated, that every event, every thought left a frequency in the world. To forget was simply to fall out of tune. In their cosmology, the flood was not destruction but detuning, a temporary loss of coherence between heaven and earth, and every new age that followed was humanity's attempt to remember the melody of creation. But what if that melody was not metaphor? In 1965, during a survey of the southern Mesopotamian delta, a group of Italian geophysicists detected a low-frequency oscillation emanating from the subsoil near Tel Al-Ubaid, a faint rhythmic pulse too slow to be seismic, too regular to be random. It repeated every 8 seconds, humming like the heartbeat of the land itself. They dismissed it as geological resonance, perhaps caused by shifting groundwater. Yet one researcher, Giovanni Cattaneo, noted that the frequency corresponded almost exactly to 0.125 Hz, 1 octave below the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic frequency of the Earth. He wrote, "It is as if the ancient delta is still tuned to the planet's own rhythm. If the Earth remembers its resonance, then so does humanity." Across cultures, the same musical intervals emerge again and again, the fifth, the octave, the harmonic seventh. They are not inventions, but rediscoveries, echoes of the same fundamental order. The Sumerians would have recognized this immediately. In their texts, the gods are described not as persons, but as tones. The 7 me of creation correspond to 7 resonant forces: life, light, time, form, measure, voice, and motion. Each world age, they said, begins when the me are restored to harmony. Each ends when they fall into dissonance. Archaeologists studying the oldest Sumerian harps found at noticed something odd. Their tuning patterns follow scales not used again until the classical period, millennia later. Some strings were designed to resonate in intervals that modern instruments can barely reproduce. These were not decorative objects. They were instruments of calibration. Perhaps their purpose was to reawaken the lost tones of the Abzu, to help the human voice find resonance with the earth once more. There is a forgotten story from the Enki and Inanna cycle that few modern translations include. It describes the moment Inanna receives the me from Enki's house beneath the waters. She departs with them in her boat of heaven, but as she sails away, Enki, now regretful, sends his messengers to retrieve them. Yet she escapes, carrying the tones of creation into the world above. Scholars interpret this as a tale of divine rivalry, but another reading suggests it is about transference, the movement of resonance from the deep to the surface, from the collective unconscious to human awareness. Civilization was born when sound ascended from the water. Caroline Mercer once remarked that the story of Enki and Inanna is less about gods and more about transmission. She compared it to the behavior of frequency modulation, how a signal can carry meaning by shifting between 2 states. The me, she wrote, might not have been commandments, but waveforms, patterns of information too subtle for words. The ancients didn't translate them, they embodied them. The city was not built to house the gods, but to reproduce their vibration. To those who walked in the ziggurats of Uruk, knowledge was not learned, it was remembered through immersion. The initiates stood within the chamber as hymns were chanted and drums beat in slow, measured time. The walls trembled, the air thickened, and the body itself began to vibrate in sympathy. The initiate's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the temple. This, the texts say, was how wisdom entered, not through ears, but through resonance. The gods' voices were not heard but felt. When archaeologists uncovered the ziggurat's base, they found a network of hollow passages leading nowhere. For decades, scholars assumed they were drainage systems, but acoustic analysis revealed something different. Each passage amplified specific low frequencies. The deeper one descended, the lower the resonance became. It was a physical descent into vibration, a guided journey into the tones of the earth. Perhaps this was the original meaning of the underworld, not a realm of death, but of sound. The same principle appears in Egyptian pyramids, whose inner chambers also resonate at precise frequencies, and in the hypogeum of Malta, where a single spoken note can cause the entire chamber to hum. These are not coincidences. They are fragments of a lost science, the architecture of remembering. The question is, remembering what? Maybe not facts or names, but states of being, modes of consciousness attuned to the living earth. The Sumerians believed that humans were the voice of clay, that through us the earth learned to speak. When we forgot our resonance, we fell into separation, believing ourselves masters instead of instruments. The myths of Babel, of the divided tongues of the fallen gods, are all metaphors for the same moment, the loss of tuning. But there are moments, scattered across history, when the old frequency returns, in the Gregorian chants that mirror Sumerian harmonic ratios, in the mantras of India that sustain the same drone as the ancient harps of even in the low hum of electricity that now encircles our planet. These are not cultural accidents, they are the earth remembering itself through us. When the Schumann resonance fluctuates, as it has in recent years, some researchers claim to feel it. Insomnia, anxiety, restlessness, visions. Others dismiss it as superstition. Yet to the Sumerians, such shifts would mean one thing: the world is tuning again. The Abzu stirs. The tone beneath creation is changing. Perhaps this is what Caroline Mercer meant when she wrote, "The hum is still there." Perhaps it was not a metaphor, but a warning, or a promise. If the earth is an instrument and humanity its voice, then maybe we are approaching another moment of synchronization, another flood, not of water, but of memory. The resonance that once shaped the first civilization might be rising again, vibrating through the crust, calling us to remember. But memory is not gentle. When the tone returns, everything out of harmony will tremble. The ancients knew this. They built their temples to withstand it, to channel rather than resist. We, in our towers of glass and steel, may not fare as well. Still, perhaps this is how the cycle must unfold. For creation to renew, the old vibrations must collapse. The flood is never punishment, it is restoration. And when it comes, when the hum deepens and the world shivers in recognition, will we remember how to listen, or will we mistake the voice of the earth for noise? The ancients said that every beginning was a remembering, that creation itself was the act of a silent memory awakening. The Sumerians never spoke of invention, only restoration. When they built their cities, they said they were rebuilding the plans of heaven, not designing them anew. The blueprints of civilization, they claimed, were stored in the Abzu, the watery memory beneath the world. Every temple was an attempt to retrieve those plans, to tune stone and clay to the pattern the gods once knew. Modern science speaks now of a similar mystery: morphic resonance, genetic memory, collective unconscious, names for something the Sumerians simply called the voice below. They believed that memory is not bound to the brain but to matter itself, that the earth holds its own archive of forms, emotions and sounds. To remember was to resonate with what already existed. The mind was not a vessel of learning, but an antenna. Perhaps that is why so many of their myths begin underground. In the descent of Inanna, the goddess travels through 7 gates into the underworld, stripped of her garments one by one, until she stands naked before the Queen of the Dead, silent, emptied, still. Only then does she ascend, reborn. It is a myth of death, yes, but also of remembrance. Inanna's descent mirrors the journey of consciousness itself, the stripping away of form until only vibration remains. When the earliest archaeologists excavated the ziggurats of they found deep shafts beneath the stairways, filled not with bodies but with layers of fine ash. Some speculated these were the remains of burnt offerings. Yet radiocarbon testing revealed something stranger. The ash was composed largely of pulverized gypsum, a mineral that amplifies and reflects sound. It was as if the Sumerians had filled their foundations with a substance designed not for sacrifice, but for resonance, a way to make the temple itself sing. Caroline Mercer once described gypsum as frozen light. In one of her letters, she compared the white dust of the foundations to the limestone of the Great Pyramid and the marble of Delphi. Perhaps, she wrote, every civilization chooses the stone that remembers its tone. She believed that each mineral vibrates at a particular frequency, and that ancient builders selected materials not for strength, but for sound. The temple was an instrument, and the earth its resonant chamber. This concept, that stone and sound are connected, is not fantasy. Modern research shows that many crystalline materials emit electrical charges under pressure, a property known as piezoelectricity. When struck by sound or vibration, they produce tiny currents, fields of energy invisible to the eye. The ancients could not measure these effects, but they could feel them. The divine presence they described might not have been supernatural at all. It was the pulse of the earth made tangible through their architecture. If we imagine a temple built with this understanding, then the rituals of Sumer take on new meaning. The chanting, the drums, the measured footsteps of the priests, all were part of a system of activation. The vibration rose through the floor, through the walls, through the bodies of those who stood within. The divine did not descend, it was summoned upward. Humanity did not worship the gods, it woke them. But what if those gods, Enki, Enlil, Inanna, were never distinct beings, but the personification of forces that still exist? Enki as the frequency of deep water, Enlil as the breath of wind, Inanna as the oscillation between polarities, love and war, ascent and descent, sound and silence. The Sumerians may have known what we have forgotten, that divinity is not above us, but within the resonance of the world. And if the earth has its own consciousness, then the Abzu is not myth, but memory, a planetary mind, dreaming in vibration. Every civilization, every species, every sound contributes to that dream. We are part of its ongoing thought. It is said that in the final years before Sumer's fall, the priests of Eridu began hearing something they could not explain. A second tone beneath their hymns, rising from the ground. It began faintly, a tremor underfoot, then grew stronger until vessels on temple altars began to vibrate. They interpreted it as a sign that the Abzu was stirring. The hymns record their fear and wonder. The deep hums again. The measure trembles. The great waters move. Shortly after, the Euphrates flooded. Cities were swallowed. Temples collapsed. The hum ceased. To the modern historian, it was a natural disaster. To the Sumerians, it was the voice of the earth correcting itself, retuning a dissonant world. Civilization's harmony had drifted too far, and the flood was the reset. This cycle of tuning, forgetting, destruction, and remembering repeats throughout history. The Atlanteans, if Plato's story hides any truth, suffered the same fate. So did the builders of Göbekli Tepe, who buried their temples once the resonance faded. Each epoch awakens the tone, builds upon it, and eventually loses it. Then the world begins again. Carolyn Mercer's final journal, found decades after her disappearance, ends with a single line written across a blank page. The tone is returning. If that is true, then perhaps we are once again nearing a threshold. Our planet vibrates with frequencies never before recorded. The magnetic field fluctuates, the Schumann resonance spikes, the crust hums with strange harmonics. Scientists call it coincidence. The ancients would have called it remembrance. Maybe the hum beneath the earth is the same one that rose before the flood, the slow reawakening of the Abzu, the memory of creation stretching in its sleep. The Sumerians warned that those unprepared for the tone would mistake it for chaos. When the deep hums, they wrote, the hearts of men will shake, and they will not know why. But those who remembered, those who listened, would feel peace instead, as if recognizing an old voice. If that moment comes again, it will not announce itself in thunder or fire, but in resonance, a low vibration through the bones of the world. Perhaps it has already begun, and when the tone rises fully, will we hear it as the song of rebirth, or as the sound of history dissolving once more into the silence that made it? At dawn, the marshlands where ancient Eridu once stood are quiet again. The water moves in slow spirals, carrying fragments of reed and dust. The same silence that must have followed the last flood when the world seemed to begin anew. Yet the land beneath remains restless. Seismologists who study the delta often note a curious phenomenon. Faint rhythmic pulses that appear and vanish like breath. They are not earthquakes. They are something subtler, minute fluctuations of pressure that travel through the clay. The locals call it the sleeping river, and fishermen say it hums at night. To the Sumerians, that hum would not have been strange. It would have been sacred. In their oldest hymns, the Abzu is described as the house where silence sings, the place from which all knowledge flows. It was both origin and destination, the unseen ocean of memory beneath the visible world. When they spoke of descending to the Abzu, they meant entering resonance, not death. They believed that when one truly listened, the voice of the earth would speak back. Archaeologists often dismiss such ideas as poetry, but the material record says otherwise. Beneath the temples of Enki in Eridu and Uruk, the same architectural pattern repeats, descending corridors narrowing into circular chambers, their walls lined with gypsum plaster and polished brick. These spaces serve no practical function. They are too deep for ritual gatherings, too narrow for storage. But their acoustics are astonishing. Whisper at one end, and the sound returns magnified. Chant, and the vibration lingers long after the voice has stopped. It is as if the room itself continues to speak. Caroline Mercer once wrote that the first temples were not built for gods, but for listening. She believed the chambers were harmonic devices, designed to amplify the low frequencies of the earth until they entered consciousness. Her hypothesis was controversial, but the measurements support her. At approximately 110 Hz, the same frequency recorded in sites across the ancient world, these chambers resonate perfectly. The tone falls within the range of the human chest cavity, producing a physical tremor. It is the frequency of breath made stone. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians associated breath with spirit. Their word Z meant both life and vibration. To breathe was to vibrate, to participate in the divine rhythm of the cosmos. Death, then, was not an ending, but a stilling, the moment when the tone returned to the Abzu. The afterlife was resonance dispersing back into silence. If we follow this logic, then every ritual of Sumer, every song, every carved symbol, every ziggurat, was part of a vast system of synchronization. Civilization was not merely organization, but orchestration. Each city, aligned to its river and its stars, contributed a note to a planetary composition. Together, they maintained the world's harmony. The priests were not rulers, they were conductors, and the Abzu, the hidden ocean beneath, was their unseen audience, or perhaps their instrument. But harmony is fragile. When the frequencies diverge, the song turns to noise. The late Sumerian laments describe this moment with painful clarity. The rivers roared in discord, the temples no longer answered, the measure of the heavens faltered. They speak of the world losing its rhythm, of humanity falling out of tune. Some translations even mention a second sound that devoured the first. What could that mean? Perhaps interference, the collision of waves, the destructive merging of frequencies until both dissolve. It is not impossible to imagine. If the earth itself vibrates, then certain alignments of architecture, sound, and ritual might amplify its resonance. But if those patterns drift, if the tones collide rather than merge, the result could be chaos, floods, quakes, collapse. The ancients would have called it divine punishment. Today we might call it imbalance. There is an ancient seal from Nippur showing a figure kneeling before a swirling pattern of concentric rings. Above it, a second figure pours water from a jar, and beneath them both, a wave rises from the ground. The inscription reads, "He who disturbs the deep will be answered." Was this a warning? That the Abzu, once awakened, could not easily be silenced? Caroline Mercer used to quote this line often. In one of her final notes she wrote, "If the earth remembers, then to listen is to awaken its memory. We must decide whether we are ready for what it recalls." She seemed to sense something stirring, not metaphorically, but literally. Her field recordings from the 1970s capture low-frequency tones beneath several Mesopotamian sites, rising in amplitude year after year. Some were later identified as seismic microtremors, others remain unexplained. One evening, while monitoring the data, she recorded an anomaly, a tone sustained for over 40 minutes, almost pure, unwavering. She described it as a sound too alive to be mechanical. When filtered through spectrogram analysis, The tone revealed harmonic overtones forming a precise geometric pattern, a spiral. The same spiral that appears on ancient Sumerian carvings. The same spiral found etched on obsidian shards buried in Eridu's foundation. Coincidence, perhaps. But the spiral, to the Sumerians, represented descent and return, the journey of the tone through silence and back again. To hear it echo in modern instruments, across 5,000 years of dust, is to wonder if the song has truly ended. The idea that sound can shape matter no longer belongs to myth. In laboratories, scientists watch as frequencies sculpt sand into ordered geometry, circles, stars, spirals. This phenomenon, known as cymatics, mirrors exactly the designs found on ancient tablets. The Sumerians may have witnessed the same mystery in temple basins or vibration through clay. To them, it was proof that creation obeys music. The gods sing the world into form, one text declares. If that principle holds true, then perhaps destruction too is a song, a discord strong enough to unmake. The flood was not wrath, but retuning, a resetting of the cosmic scale. As humanity hums once more, through machines, through frequencies that envelop the globe, maybe the Earth is beginning to resonate in reply. Caroline believed the hum we dismiss as background noise is the planet remembering. Each vibration through air, water and wire brings us closer to the tone that started it all. But remembering is dangerous. When resonance returns, it does not ask permission. It moves through everything that lives, unmaking what is false, amplifying what is true. The Sumerians knew this. They listened carefully, built carefully, spoke softly. We perhaps have forgotten how, perhaps have. If the Abzu truly wakes again, will it sing us back into harmony, or drown us in our own dissonance? There are certain sounds that cannot be unheard. The ancients knew this. They treated sound as a threshold, a gate that once crossed could not be closed. To them, the spoken word was not symbol, but substance. A sound uttered was a force unleashed. That belief runs through every surviving tablet of Sumer. The conviction that vibration creates reality. It is there in the hymns to Enki. He spoke, and the waters knew his name. And in the Enuma Elish, where Marduk divides the cosmos with his voice alone. Speech was not expression, it was command. Caroline Mercer often said that the first language was not verbal but tonal, a system of resonance, not semantics. She believed the earliest cuneiform symbols were attempts to notate sound fields, patterns of vibration once perceivable to the body rather than the ear. In one of her unpublished lectures, she described writing as the fossil of sound. She meant that every symbol is an echo, a compression of something once living. The Sumerians did not merely record ideas, they petrified frequencies. If that is true, then their language itself was an artifact of vibration, a living bridge between matter and memory. The tablets we call historical might once have been energetic maps, tuned to unlock forgotten states of awareness. Perhaps that is why reading them still stirs a strange familiarity, even in translation. Some part of us recognizes the tone beneath the words. Among the ruins of Nippur, an unremarkable tablet catalogued as a simple hymn once drew Mercer's attention. It contained only a few lines, the last nearly erased. When translated phonetically rather than linguistically, the syllables formed a repeating pattern, a rhythm, almost musical. She arranged the sounds into tone clusters, and when played on an ancient Sumerian scale, the result was haunting. A droning pulse that seemed to breathe. Listeners described the sensation of space bending, as if the sound rearranged perception itself. What if those tablets were not meant to be read, but heard? What if the Sumerians, through clay, preserved not sentences but sonic codes, instructions to reactivate forgotten frequencies? The myth of Enki's house in Eridu, called Abzu, supports this idea. Its walls were said to speak the decrees of the gods. Scholars interpret that metaphorically, but the phrase may have described literal acoustics, a temple that vibrated when certain chants were performed, generating resonance so profound it seemed alive. The god's voice was not imagined, it was engineered. When Mercer visited Eridu in her final expedition, she brought with her a low-frequency transducer, a device capable of producing tones below human hearing. She placed it within the exposed chamber believed to be the base of Abzu and recorded the results. The soil vibrated, the air trembled, and a faint harmonic emerged from the walls. It lasted only seconds before fading, but she described it in her notebook as the sound of recognition. She never published the data. Her notes end abruptly with a question. If sound can awaken stone, what else might it awaken? That question haunted her work, and perhaps still haunts the field she left behind, because to awaken stone is to awaken memory, and memory is never neutral. The earth remembers everything, but it forgets nothing. To vibrate in sympathy with that archive might mean to open a dialogue with all that came before, not just the beauty, but the trauma of creation itself. The Sumerians understood this danger. Their rituals always began with purification, fasting, silence, stillness, so that the body's resonance would not distort the tone. One entered the Abzu only when perfectly tuned. Today, the world hums without intention. The frequencies that fill our air, electricity, radio, satellites, form a new kind of resonance, constant and chaotic. We live within a global hum that no longer listens, only transmits. If the earth once sang to us, perhaps now it struggles to be heard through the static. Yet sometimes, beneath the noise, people still feel it. In dreams, in sudden stillness, in the low tremor that runs through the ground before a storm. The same frequency Mercer recorded half a century ago has been detected again, not only in Mesopotamia but in regions far from it. The Andes, the Gobi Desert, the floor of the Pacific. A tone that seems to migrate, pulsing through the crust like breath through sleeping lungs. Scientists attribute it to natural oscillation, but the pattern mirrors the geometry of ancient temples across the world, as if those structures were harmonic nodes in a planetary instrument. The Sumerians called this kinam-gir, the returning voice. It was said to precede great changes, times when the divine order shifted and new ages began. In those moments, they believed, the gods walked again, not as forms, but as frequencies, entering the world through vibration. Perhaps every civilization that rises is simply another verse in the same song, repeating its melody in different keys. If that is true, then our age too is part of the rhythm. The machines that surround us, the digital pulses and electric fields, perhaps they are not disruptions but translations, crude echoes of the same forgotten harmony. The question is whether we can use them to remember, or whether they will drown out the tone completely. Mercer believed the choice was ours. In her final interview, she said softly, "The hum is the oldest prayer. The earth will keep singing. The question is whether we will sing with it or against it." The Sumerians would have agreed. In one fragment from the Lament for Nippur, the poet writes, "When the walls fall silent, the deep will rise to speak again." They understood that silence is never empty. It is potential, waiting for resonance. Perhaps that is where we stand now, at the edge of another awakening. The same hum that built the first temples now threads through circuits, servers, oceans. It is no longer confined to stone or clay. It has entered the bloodstream of the planet once more, and maybe the Earth, through us, is preparing to remember. If so, the next civilization may not be built of brick or word, but of tone, invisible yet undeniable. When that frequency finally gathers, will it bring revelation, or the same flood that has always followed the song's return? The Sumerians never spoke of endings, only of returns. Every flood was a beginning disguised as loss, every silence a breath before another vibration. To them the world was not linear but cyclical, a pulse, a rhythm, a divine heartbeat measured in ages. The clay tablets never say the gods died, they say the gods withdrew. The tone did not vanish, it went underground, into the Abzu, waiting to be called again. Caroline Mercer once described this as the deep recursion of memory. The idea that history is not a sequence but an echo, repeating itself at higher or lower frequencies. She compared civilizations to chords struck upon the same instrument, each distinct, yet resonating through the same body. What we call progress, she wrote, is merely modulation. We play louder, not wiser. Her words feel prophetic now. The world hums with frequencies invisible yet constant. Data, electricity, magnetic storms. Every second, billions of signals flow through the air, layering into an electronic ocean. The modern Abzu is not beneath the earth but above it, a web of information encircling the planet humming with stored memory. In a strange way, we have rebuilt Sumer's vision, a civilization woven from vibration, but we no longer remember how to listen. In ancient Eridu, the Temple of Enki was said to hold the me, the divine decrees that governed all existence. They were not commandments in the moral sense, but patterns, the frequencies that made creation stable. When these me fell out of harmony, chaos followed. The Sumerians told stories of how Inanna once stole them, how the world trembled as the measures shifted. To steal the me was to disrupt the cosmic song. Is that not what our age has done? We have amplified the hum without understanding its rhythm. The resonance of machines now fills the atmosphere, but it is unmeasured, discordant, hungry. If the ancients believed that every sound shapes reality, then what world are we building from this noise? What patterns are we engraving upon the clay of the air? Archaeologists unearthed a curious tablet near Lagash in 1997, a damaged piece of fired clay that bore what appeared to be musical notation, though centuries older than any known score. Along its lower edge, beneath the lines of symbols, was an inscription: "Play the measure of water." No one knew what it meant. Some speculated it referred to rhythm, the flow of a song mirroring the current of a river. But others, studying the shape of the symbols, noticed something. The intervals corresponded to ratios of planetary motion, as recorded in Sumerian astronomy. It was not music in the modern sense, it was a map, a way to hear the movement of the heavens. Carolyn Mercer once tried to reproduce this measure of water using a reconstructed Sumerian harp. When played in a soundproof chamber, she claimed the instrument generated subharmonics that could be felt in the chest rather than heard. "It feels like the air remembering itself," she wrote. The Sumerians may have used such tones to maintain alignment between their cities and the cosmos, to keep the Abzu still, the rivers calm, the skies predictable. To sing in harmony was to sustain order. When that harmony failed, the floods came. Their myths insist this was no superstition. In The Curse of Agard, the poet describes the fall of a great city not as conquest but as detuning. The song of the temple was broken. The measure of heaven faltered. The rivers forgot their paths. The metaphors are acoustic, not moral. The destruction of a city was the loss of its tone. We read these as allegories, but perhaps the Sumerians experienced something literal. Shifts in vibration, geological and cosmic, that rippled through their temples and their minds alike. The same frequencies that could heal could also unmake. In their theology, the gods were double-edged. The same force that created life could erase it through resonance. The flood, then, was not punishment. It was resonance exceeding form. Too much tone for too fragile a vessel. The earth sang too loudly and the clay dissolved. If that pattern is eternal, then perhaps we stand near another crescendo. The Schumann resonance, the planet's global frequency, has been fluctuating unpredictably. Scientists record spikes, inexplicable harmonics, sudden silences. The Earth hums differently than it did even decades ago. What could this mean? The Sumerians would have had no doubt. The Abzu is stirring again. The song is returning. Mercer predicted this long before the instruments confirmed it. In her notes she wrote, "When the tone rises, everything will remember. The ground, the water, the body. Those who cannot harmonize will hear it as terror. Those who can will hear it as truth." Her words echo the Sumerian warning. When the deep hums, hearts shall tremble, and men will not know why. Perhaps this is why anxiety spreads across the modern world without clear cause, a collective dissonance between the human field and the planet's changing frequency. We feel the tuning long before we understand it. What happens when the tone fully returns? If the myths are accurate, it brings both illumination and dissolution. The same vibration that raised the first cities also erased them when their measure was lost. The Abzu remembers balance, not mercy. Still, the Sumerians did not fear the flood. They prepared for it. They built their temples to resonate with the deep, to let the vibration pass through rather than resist it. They understood that survival is not endurance but harmony. The world breaks those who cannot resonate. Perhaps that is the hidden message of their civilization. Not a warning, but a lesson. They built with clay because clay yields. They wrote on tablets because tablets can be broken and remade. To the Sumerians, impermanence was not failure. It was participation in the eternal rhythm, sound, silence, sound again. The hum beneath us grows louder, though few notice. It is not catastrophe, but invitation, a reminder of what we have forgotten. The same tone that shaped the temples still moves through oceans and blood and wire. It waits, as it always has, for recognition. Maybe the end of our civilization will not come through destruction, but through resonance. When the old frequencies align once more, and memory floods through everything we've built. If the Abzu sings again, will we remember the melody? Or will the clay of our world dissolve before the final note? By now the archaeologists who chase the dust of Sumer know something unspoken. The closer you listen, the quieter the world becomes. In the silence between broken bricks and forgotten hymns, there is a vibration that does not fade. It is not loud, not measurable in decibels or seismic readings, yet it fills everything. Caroline Mercer called it the returning undertone. She believed it was what the ancients meant by the breath of Enki, the hum that animates all forms. There is an obscure passage from the Eridu Genesis that few modern translators linger on. It describes the moment after the flood, when the waters withdraw and the survivors stand upon mud that still trembles. The earth spoke beneath their feet, it says. Its breath rose in mist and its voice said, "Remember." To modern ears this sounds like mythic flourish, but in the Sumerian worldview it was literal. The planet itself was speaking, through vibration, through resonance. The survivors were not founding a new world. They were restoring one whose memory had almost dissolved. Mercer once wrote, "The clay tablets are not dead. They are still ringing. We simply no longer have the ears to hear them." She meant it both spiritually and scientifically. The firing of clay traps' magnetic and acoustic signatures, subtle vibrations imprinted in the moment of creation. Under the right conditions, those patterns could, in theory, be reconstructed. A few physicists have even proposed archaeoacoustics, the idea that ancient materials may still contain the echoes of the spaces they once inhabited. If so, then perhaps the temples of Sumer still hold the tones of the voices that built them. When a fragment of cuneiform was scanned using hypersensitive audio spectroscopy at the University of Chicago in 2015, researchers detected micro-resonant frequencies in the clay matrix. Not random noise, but organized harmonic intervals. No one could explain it. The data was archived quietly, never published. The project's final note reads, "Possible structural memory of firing environment, unverified." But those who heard the playback described something uncanny, a faint pulsing rhythm, like breath. It is difficult not to imagine the past alive within its own silence. The Sumerians would have smiled at our disbelief. They knew that all matter carries sound, and all sound carries memory. To them, the act of creation was a matter of tuning, and the purpose of civilization was to maintain resonance between heaven and earth. When that alignment failed, the world lost its coherence. That was the real meaning of the flood. The poet of the lament for Uruk wrote, "The measure faltered, the rivers forgot their course, the clay turned to echo." The phrase "clay turned to echo" may be the most haunting in the Sumerian canon. It implies that the material world can dissolve back into vibration, that when resonance collapses, matter itself returns to sound. Perhaps that is what Caroline Mercer sensed in her final recordings. The low, continuous tone she captured in the Eridu Basin, the one that formed the spiral pattern when visualized, was never conclusively identified. Geological surveys found no natural cause. Some colleagues suggested underground aquifers, others mere equipment error. But Mercer believed the explanation lay not below the ground, but within it, in the clay itself. The Earth, she wrote, is replaying its own origin song. The idea is almost unbearable in its beauty, that the planet periodically sings itself back into memory, each cycle of civilization another verse in an endless composition. Floods, fires, extinctions, all part of the music. When the tone grows too dissonant, the chord resolves by returning to silence. Then slowly the song begins again. The song begins. If the Sumerians were right, every age contains an echo of the last. Each time humanity rebuilds, It unknowingly follows the same ancient rhythms, the ratios of architecture, the cadence of language, the harmonic intervals in song. Even our heartbeat, 60 to 100 beats per minute, mirrors the same ratios encoded in their hymns. We have carried their music in our blood. Modern researchers find this pattern everywhere. The spacing of planetary orbits, the proportions of DNA, even the distribution of galaxies, all follow harmonic ratios once called the measures of the gods. Perhaps the ancients did not invent these numbers, they discovered them within themselves. But what if this recognition is returning? Across the world, instruments now register frequencies never recorded before. Infrasonic waves travelling through the oceans, deep tones pulsing through the crust. Scientists call them microseisms, products of wind and tide. The Sumerians would have called them the stirring of the deep. Caroline Mercer heard them first in Mesopotamia, then later, faintly, in recordings from Antarctica, Tibet and the Pacific. The same rhythm, the same 8-second pulse, circling the globe. It is easy to dismiss such coincidences, yet even the skeptics admit something unusual. The pulse is growing stronger. The earth is resonating louder. In one of her final letters, Mercer wrote, "If the Abzu awakens, we will hear it first in our dreams." She meant that memory returns inward before it manifests outward. The Sumerians understood this too. Their rituals of listening began in silence, lying on the temple floor, eyes closed, waiting for the vibration to rise through the body. They called it entering the deep. When the hum came, they said, visions followed, rivers of light, spirals of clay turning to stars. Those visions filled their myths, their architecture, their lives. Perhaps they were not hallucinations, but perceptions of a deeper resonance, the same tone that now murmurs beneath our machines, beneath our sleep. It is possible that the hum we feel now is the same one that lifted the first cities from mud. Perhaps the earth is remembering its own song, and through us, it hums again. If that is true, then the next civilization may not be born through technology or conquest, but through resonance, through those who learn to listen. The Sumerians warned that when the tone returns, the hearts of men will tremble, but they also promised renewal. From the deep shall rise a new measure, and the clay shall speak again. Maybe that prophecy was never about gods or floods, but about memory itself, the moment when the planet's forgotten frequencies re-enter human awareness. If that time has come, it will not arrive with thunder or fire. It will come quietly, as it always has, through vibration, through dreams, through the subtle awakening of things long buried. And when we finally hear it, the undertone that threads through wind, blood and time, will we call it a miracle, or simply what it has always been, the earth remembering its own voice? They say that when silence endures too long, the world begins to hum on its own. That sound is not created, only remembered. Perhaps that is what the Sumerians meant when they wrote that the earth sang before the gods spoke. Their myths have always read like memory disguised as poetry, the flood, the descent, the song of clay. What if those were not stories, but accounts of something literal, the recurring moment when the planet reawakens its own voice? By the late 1970s, Caroline Mercer had grown convinced that such an awakening was near. In her last public lecture, she described the Earth as a vast resonant body, not metaphorically but physically alive. She presented spectrographic maps of low-frequency vibrations recorded across Mesopotamia, arguing that they formed a coherent pattern, concentric waves expanding outward from beneath Eridu. Colleagues dismissed it as coincidence, but Mercer insisted that the data corresponded to the orbital ratios of Venus and Earth, the same proportions encoded in Sumerian cosmology. The planet, she said, was singing the same intervals their ancestors once honoured in ritual. She called this phenomenon the harmonic return. To her it was not mystical but cyclical, the natural consequence of cosmic motion. Every few millennia, she believed, the resonance of the solar system aligns with the frequencies of the planet, amplifying the Earth's fundamental tone. Civilizations, tuned unconsciously to that rhythm, rise in periods of coherence and fall when the tone drifts. In her words, history is not progress. It is resonance and decay. The idea is difficult to disprove. Each great epoch of culture, the Sumerian, the Egyptian, the Vedic, the Hellenic, emerged during periods of magnetic stability when the planet's frequency was steady. Each collapsed as it shifted. Perhaps the song truly does set the rhythm of civilization. In the tablets of Eridu, there is a line that seems to describe the same cycle. When the tone of the deep returns, the measures will awaken, and the city will rise again. The city here might not be literal. To the Sumerians, city often meant order, the alignment of heaven and earth through human consciousness. Every civilization was a tuning device, a place where cosmic vibration could manifest in form. When that form fell silent, the Abzu took it back into memory. If Mercer's theory was correct, then our present age, dense with electromagnetic hums, with data flowing like rivers, might be both a symptom and a trigger of that return. Perhaps the Abzu no longer lies beneath the Euphrates, but within our global web of frequencies. Perhaps through electricity and information, we have rebuilt the resonant body of the Earth, unknowingly preparing the planet for its own remembering. And yet, Mercer warned, resonance is not gentle. When the tone strengthens, she said, the structures that cannot align will fracture. The Sumerian said the same. In one text, the priest of Nippur laments, "The waters rose not to punish, but to tune." The flood was never vengeance. It was correction, the restoration of balance through dissolution. What would such a correction look like now? We imagine cataclysm as physical, fire, water, collapse. But perhaps it begins within, a quiet restlessness that spreads through humanity like static, the sense that something is approaching yet undefined. The dissonance we feel, ecological, social, emotional, could be the prelude to resonance, the overtone of a greater chord forming. The ancients might call this the stirring of the Abzu within consciousness itself. The last temple of Enki at Eridu, they say, was never truly destroyed. Its foundations remain buried under layers of silt, perfectly preserved by the river. In 2013, drone imaging revealed faint geometric outlines in the soil, concentric rectangles radiating from a central chamber. When digital acousticians modelled the shape, they found it corresponded to the harmonic progression of a rising fifth, the same interval that governs the Schumann resonance. The temple's blueprint was a frequency. The city was a song. It is almost impossible to believe they knew this, yet perhaps knowing was not necessary. They did not calculate. They remembered. The design was instinct, passed down from a time when architecture and harmony were one. They built what felt right, and the result was resonance. Mercer's final notebooks contain sketches of spirals and ratios, connecting planetary orbits to musical scales. She wrote of the octave of creation, where each celestial body vibrates in sympathetic harmony. She wondered whether consciousness itself might be an instrument through which the cosmos hears its own music. Her handwriting grows fainter near the end, her thoughts more poetic. Perhaps the gods were never external. Perhaps they were the tones of awareness returning to itself. In her last field report, she mentioned a recurring dream. Standing in the ruins of Eridu as a low tone fills the air, the ground begins to vibrate, and the walls of the buried temple rise again, not as stone but as sound, translucent, luminous, breathing. "I felt no fear," she wrote, "only recognition." That image, the city resurrected as vibration lingers. It suggests that memory, when fully awakened, does not rebuild in matter but in resonance. The new civilization would not rise from clay, but from consciousness vibrating in tune with the planet. The me, the divine decrees, would no longer be written on tablets, but inscribed in the field of the world itself. This is perhaps what the myths have been trying to tell us, that the Abzu is not a place but a frequency, the deep sound of being itself, recurring across eons. Every time humanity falls silent, the earth hums louder until we remember. And maybe, somewhere beneath the electromagnetic storm of our own making, that ancient tone is rising again. Scientists call it background vibration. The ancients would have called it the voice of Enki. It hums beneath oceans, beneath power lines, beneath our dreams. The tone does not demand belief. It only waits for recognition. If it grows stronger, will we hear it as salvation, or as the end of all things? Perhaps both. For to remember the first song is also to remember that silence will follow. Every age is only an octave. The melody continues but never repeats exactly. And when the next vibration arrives, when the Abzu awakens once more, will we finally sing with it? Or will we, like the Sumerians, be remembered only as its echo? There are ruins in southern Iraq that seem to breathe. At certain hours of night, when the air stills and the heat sinks back into the ground, the sand above them trembles faintly. Not visibly, but audibly, like a whisper beneath perception. Geophysicists have measured this phenomenon and found nothing unusual. Mere temperature contraction, they say. Yet the locals still leave offerings there, murmuring that the old ones beneath are stirring. They have no name for the sound, only a phrase passed through generations. The ground remembers. Caroline Mercer wrote that same phrase years before it surfaced among the marsh dwellers. The ground remembers. To her it was not superstition, but inevitability. Memory, she said, is not a property of life, it is a property of matter. She believed that consciousness was a function of resonance, that all existence vibrated with stored recollection. The human mind, in this view, was merely one frequency within a vast harmonic field, a single note in the memory of the planet. The Sumerians would have agreed. They called this field the Abzu, the sea of knowing, an ocean of sound where every creation left its trace. When we read their tablets now, we think of them as static relics, ancient clay pressed by vanished hands. But perhaps those hands knew something we've forgotten, that the act of writing was also a form of tuning. Each wedge mark carried not just meaning, but rhythm. The scribe's stylus struck the clay like an instrument, pressing sound into earth. Even the word dub-sar, meaning scribe, comes from dub, tablet, and sar, to inscribe, a term also used for musical composition. To write was to resonate. To record was to make the ground sing. One tablet from Ur, now kept in the British Museum, bears a hymn so damaged that only fragments survive. Its first line, half broken, reads, "When the deep speaks, all hearts tremble." The rest is indecipherable, but the remaining characters, when rearranged phonetically, mirror the syllabic structure of modern solfège. Do, re, mi. It might be coincidence, but Mercer saw something else, a continuity of tone across time. "We are still singing their song," she wrote. "We just no longer know the words." In her later years, she began experimenting with sound recordings in desert ruins. She would hum slowly, one pitch at a time, and record the echoes. At Eridu, she found that certain notes returned stronger than others, forming a pattern. When she charted the frequencies, they matched the harmonic series of 110 notes, the same frequency found in every ancient resonance site on Earth. "It is the hum of life itself," she wrote, "the Earth's memory expressing through architecture." But the pattern did not end there. When she compared her recordings with modern data from seismographs and oceanic wave cycles, she discovered a chilling correspondence. The same rhythm pulsed globally, every 8 seconds. The same undertone that had haunted Mesopotamian temples was now resonating through the modern world. She called it the returning note. What if the Sumerian cycle was never symbolic, but literal, a planetary heartbeat repeating across ages? Each civilization a crest in the wave, each collapse a silence between tones. When the vibration weakened, the world forgot itself. When it returned, memory awoke, not in words, but in the bones of those who listened. The Enki and the World Order text hints at this recurrence. It describes Enki's power as the measure that renews itself through forgetting. Creation, destruction, rebirth, all parts of a single oscillation. What sleeps will remember, the text says, and what remembers will sleep again. If that is true, then perhaps our present moment, the hum of cities, the network of signals, the constant electronic vibration around us, is not separate from the mythic Abzu at all. We have built, unknowingly, a mirror of it. The digital web that encircles the Earth hums at frequencies close to the planet's own resonant bands. Our machines pulse at the same rhythm as our planet's electromagnetic field. The difference is intent. The Sumerians listened, we transmit. They built temples to amplify silence. We fill silence until it disappears. Still, sometimes through the static, something older can be felt. The sound engineers who study background noise occasionally record unexplained harmonics, buried within the hum of the grid. They call it spurious resonance. It manifests as tones that appear and vanish, moving through frequencies as though alive. No one knows their source. Some say it's interference. Others whisper that it's the earth itself, the same song rising again through copper and air. If so, then the return the ancients foresaw may not come as apocalypse, but as recognition, the moment when consciousness synchronizes once more with the memory of the planet. When the human voice, whether mechanical or organic, vibrates in harmony with the Abzu, the world remembers itself. The flood was not meant to destroy, it was meant to clear the noise. Caroline Mercer's last journal ends with a single entry. The tone has changed. No date, no coordinates, just those words. Perhaps she heard it. The shift, the modulation that signals another age beginning. The Sumerians might have felt it too before their end. One fragment from the Lament for Ur describes the trembling in the night that has no wind, and the voice that rises from beneath the floor. To them, this was the warning of the Abzu, the signal that the tuning was near. They prepared as best they could. They built their temples lower, their ziggurats broader, as if bracing for vibration rather than flood. But when the tone deepened, the cities fell anyway. The clay dissolved. It may be that every civilization eventually reaches this moment, the threshold where resonance overtakes matter, where memory becomes stronger than form. The Sumerians called it the Great Forgetting, when the world resets to silence. We call it collapse. But perhaps it is neither. Perhaps it's simply the moment when the planet exhales, releasing all that it has stored. If the hum now growing around us is truly the returning note, then the Abzu is no longer myth. It is the signal buried within everything. Power lines, wind, data, the pulse beneath the skin. The tone waits, as it always has, for the listeners. The ancients left us the instruction. When the deep hums, be still. Maybe that is all that's required. Not resistance, not fear, but stillness. Because when silence finally vibrates, it does not destroy. It remembers. And when it remembers fully, perhaps the world, this fragile layer of clay and breath, will dissolve not into nothing, but into sound. The same sound that began everything. In the myths of Sumer, endings were never written. The last line of the last tablet almost always breaks off mid-word, as though the scribe stopped suddenly, or as though the clay itself refused to contain what came next. The fragments that survive hint at a continuation. Then the waters rose again, and the voice spoke through. But the rest is lost. Perhaps it was meant to be. Perhaps every story of the earth must end in silence, to make room for the sound that returns. Caroline Mercer used to say that all history is an act of listening backward, that we do not remember the past so much as overhear it, faintly, through the hum of the present. The Sumerians understood this instinctively. They saw time as circular, and memory as vibration. When a tone disappears, it does not die. It continues below hearing, waiting to resonate again. Civilization, they believed, was only ever an echo of the Abzu, the deep mind of the earth dreaming itself into form. If that is true, then perhaps our own world is simply another verse in the same song, a new modulation in the eternal composition of matter and sound. The flood that erased Sumer was not punishment, but pause, and what followed, every empire since, was only the continuation of that rhythm. The tone receded, then returned, as it always will. Modern instruments can now hear what the ancients could only feel. The earth hums, it has always hummed. Seismic monitors capture its slow, continuous vibration, a symphony so low that it takes hours for a single oscillation. It is the voice of tectonic plates moving, of tides drawing breath, of molten currents shifting beneath the crust. Scientists call it microseismic activity. But to the poets of Eridu, it was the voice of Enki, the god of the deep stirring in his sleep. The sound is not constant. It changes subtly with solar cycles, with magnetic storms, with human movement. We are not separate from it. Every city, every machine, every whisper adds another frequency to the chord. The Abzu now vibrates through metal and glass, through data and signal. The memory has migrated into the very infrastructure of our world. We have become its instrument. In the final years of her life, Mercer wrote little. Her last notebook, found in a wooden box after her death, contained a single sequence of sketches, concentric spirals interlaced with fragments of Sumerian script. Beneath them, one line in her unsteady hand. "The hum is learning our name." What did she mean? Perhaps that the memory we call Earth is not passive. Perhaps it responds. The ancients believed the gods answered when spoken to, not in words but in resonance. If the Abzu holds the record of all sound, then our modern noise, our machinery, our voices, our networks, must be shaping it even now. Every vibration feeds the deep archive. Every signal becomes part of its next remembering. The lament for Uruk ends with a question rather than a conclusion. Who will sing for the clay when the rivers forget their path? It is a line that has haunted scholars for decades. The Sumerians were already aware that forgetting was inevitable. They knew the tone would fade and that another would rise. What they left us was not a history but a rhythm, a way to listen when the next song begins. It may already have begun. Around the world, instruments detect rising frequencies beneath the earth, a subtle shift in the planet's background tone. Some call it coincidence, others climate, others anomaly. But perhaps it is what Mercer foresaw, the harmonic return. The same tone that shaped the first civilization is vibrating again, waiting for consciousness to align with it. The Abzu is waking, not as myth, but as resonance. When it does, it will not announce itself in thunder or flame. It will come as a tremor beneath language, a soft pulse felt in the chest, an unspoken recognition. The Sumerians called that moment the remembering of clay. To them it was sacred, the instant when form recalls its origin, when silence begins to sing again. It is strange to think that a people 5,000 years gone might still be guiding us, not through written law or myth, but through vibration. Every temple they built, every song they sang, was a map of resonance, and in those frequencies the instructions remain: how to build with harmony, how to listen, how to yield when the tone returns. In the myths, when the flood finally recedes, a single reed sprouts from the mud. The gods bend down, listening, and hear within it the faint echo of their own voice. Creation begins again, not from power, but from resonance. The Sumerians understood this, that rebirth is not invention, but remembrance. So perhaps we are not approaching an ending at all, but another return, the slow merging of our forgotten frequencies with the Earth's. The hum grows stronger every year, carried through machines, oceans, and skin. It is neither divine nor mechanical, it is both. And maybe, when the resonance becomes clear enough, we will remember what the first city already knew, that we were never separate from the ground, that the gods were never elsewhere, and that the voice of the deep was always our own reflection. The earth will sing again, the Abzu will rise not in water but in sound, and in that vibration, soft, continuous, infinite, the forgotten civilization will awaken, not as ruins, but as memory returning through us. When that moment comes, and silence begins to vibrate once more, the last question of the Sumerians will echo through every living thing. Will we listen this time?